The Sauce of Injustice. The evening at Belladonna's Bistro, an upscale restaurant perched in the heart of the city, was its usual symphony of clinking glasses, murmured conversations, and the soft hum of jazz. Waitress Lena Brooks, dressed in her crisp white uniform, moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays of fine cuisine. For Lena, this wasn't just a job, it was survival. Every tip went toward keeping the lights on in her small apartment and food on the table for her 5-year-old son, Miles. It was a Friday night, and the bistro was packed with the city's elite. Among them was James Carter, a notorious millionaire with an air of smug entitlement. His presence was hard to miss. His booming voice cut through the din, and his gold watch gleamed every time he gestured grandly. He sat at his favorite table near the center of the room, commanding attention like a king in his court. For James, this was his playground, a place where the world bent to his whims. But Lena saw through the facade. She had served him enough times to recognize the subtle cruelty in his eyes, the way he spoke down to the staff, and the dismissive wave of his hand whenever someone dared to displease him. Tonight, however, his disdain reached new heights. A brewing storm. Lena approached James's table cautiously, her tray balanced with precision. She set down his drink, ensuring everything was perfectly in place. "Your bourbon, sir," she said politely, stepping back to let him enjoy his meal. James barely acknowledged her. Instead, he turned his attention to the dish in front of him, a steak cooked medium rare with a side of asparagus. But something about the presentation seemed to annoy him. He scowled and muttered, "Is this what you call service? It's pathetic." Lena hesitated, unsure if the comment was directed at her or the chef. She chose diplomacy. "I'm sorry, sir. Is there something wrong with your meal? I can have the chef make it again." James's eyes narrowed, his lip curling. "What's wrong?" "Everything is wrong. This steak is dry. The sauce is bland. And you." His voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby diners. "You can't even serve it properly." The room grew quieter, patrons casting curious glances at the unfolding scene. Lena's cheeks flushed, but she kept her composure. "I'll bring this back to the kitchen end." But James wasn't done. He reached for the bottle of chili sauce on the table, his movements deliberate. With a smug grin, he uncapped it and flung the fiery red liquid toward her. The silence that followed. The sauce splattered across Lena's face, staining her uniform and burning her skin. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by an oppressive silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The elite patrons, so quick to voice their opinions moments earlier, suddenly became mute spectators. Lena stood frozen, the heat of the sauce a sharp sting on her cheeks, but it was the humiliation that cut the deepest. Her vision blurred as she tried to process what had just happened. Her trembling hands reached for a napkin to wipe her face, but it felt futile. James leaned back in his chair, chuckling. "Maybe next time, you'll learn to do your job properly," he sneered, his voice oozing superiority. The room remained silent. No one dared to intervene. The manager, Richard Saunders, hovered near the bar, his gaze darting nervously between Lena and James. He looked like a man caught between his conscience and his wallet. James was a regular, a man who spent thousands at the restaurant. Richard wasn't about to risk losing that. Lena turned and walked toward the kitchen, her head held high despite the tears threatening to spill. She refused to let James see her break. A moment of clarity. In the kitchen, Lena leaned against the counter, her breath shaky. Her coworkers avoided her gaze, their silence louder than any words. She wiped the sauce from her face, her reflection in the stainless steel counter staring back at her. The woman she saw wasn't just a waitress. She was a mother, a fighter, someone who had faced more hardships than most of the patrons in that dining room could imagine. But tonight was different. Tonight, something inside her snapped. She wasn't just angry. She was done. Done with the microaggressions, the dismissive comments, and the blatant disrespect. This wasn't just about her. It was about every worker who had ever been treated as invisible. Lena thought of Miles, of the life she wanted to give him. She had always told him to stand up for what was right, to never let anyone make him feel small. How could she preach that to her son if she didn't live by it herself? The whispered secrets. As Lena wiped her uniform clean, she overheard a hushed conversation between two cooks near the pantry. "I heard Carter's been under investigation," one of them whispered. "For what?" the other asked. "Money laundering, fraud, you name it. Guys as dirty as they come." Lena's ears perked up. She didn't know much about James Carter's business dealings, but this sounded serious. Could it be true? Could the man who had humiliated her be hiding something that could bring him down? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She didn't have the power to fight James Carter on her own, but maybe, just maybe, she could find someone who did. The seed of an idea. That night, as Lena walked home, the city lights reflecting in the puddles on the sidewalk, her mind raced. She couldn't let this go. Not this time. James Carter had made a mistake. He had underestimated her. She thought of the whispers about his shady dealings, the documents she had seen him signing at the restaurant, the way he always seemed to be meeting with people in hushed tones. There was more to James Carter than met the eye, and Lena was determined to find out what it was. For the first time in years, Lena felt a spark of hope. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. And James Carter was about to learn that the hard way. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The weight of silence. The walk home from Belladonna's bistro felt longer than usual. The crisp night air stung Lena's cheeks, mingling with the lingering burn of the chili sauce. Her uniform was ruined, the fiery red stains acting as a cruel reminder of the evening's humiliation. Yet, despite the ache in her chest and the tears threatening to spill, Lena held her head high. As she approached her apartment building, the dim yellow lights of the entrance flickered ominously, a reflection of the instability in her own life. Inside, the familiar clutter of toys greeted her. Miles's beloved action figures scattered across the worn carpet. The sight of her son sleeping soundly on the couch, his small frame wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a bittersweet comfort. Lena bent down and kissed his forehead softly, careful not to wake him. Her mother, Patricia, who often babysat while Lena worked late, stirred from the armchair nearby. "You're home late," Patricia said, her voice groggy but warm. "Rough night." Lena hesitated. She didn't want to burden her mother with the details, but the weight of what had happened was too much to bear alone. As she began recounting the incident, James Carter's venomous words, the chili sauce, the silence of the room. Patricia's face darkened. "That man, he's nothing but a coward hiding behind his money," Patricia said, her voice trembling with anger. "But Lena, you've got to be careful. People like him don't fight fair." "I know, Mom," Lena replied, her voice quiet but firm. "But I can't just let this go. If I don't stand up for myself now, when will I?" Patricia reached out and squeezed Lena's hand. "Just promise me you'll be smart about it. Miles needs you." Lena nodded, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about her dignity. It was about setting an example for her son. The next morning, she would start gathering the pieces she needed to fight back. Unseen connections. The following day, Lena returned to work, her nerves steeled. The stares from her coworkers were hard to ignore. Some were sympathetic, others indifferent, but none offered words of support. It was the silence that hurt most. Proof of how fear and complacency could paralyze even the best of people. Lena, Richard Saunders, the restaurant manager, called from his office as she walked past. "A word, please." She braced herself as she stepped into his small, cluttered office. Richard's face was pale, his hands fidgeting with a pen. He gestured for her to sit, but Lena remained standing, her arms crossed. "I wanted to talk about last night," Richard began, his voice low and strained. "What happened with Mr. Carter? It was unfortunate. But you know how important he is to this restaurant. He's a regular, a valuable client." Lena stared at him, incredulous. "Unfortunate?" He threw chili sauce in my face, Richard, in front of everyone. Richard sighed, avoiding her gaze. Look, I get it. What he did was wrong. But this isn't just about you. If we make a big deal out of this, it could hurt the restaurant. And frankly, you can't afford to lose this job. The words hung heavy in the air. Lena felt a sharp pang of anger and disappointment. So that's it, she said, her voice trembling. You're just going to let him get away with it. Richard shifted uncomfortably. I'm asking you to be reasonable, Lena. Think about your son. The mention of Miles felt like a slap. Lena stood frozen for a moment before speaking, her voice icy. I am thinking about my son. That's why I can't stay quiet. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the office, her heart pounding. Richard's cowardice only fueled her determination. She wasn't going to let James Carter's money and power silence her. The detective's visit. That evening, as the dinner rush began to swell, Lena noticed a woman entering the restaurant. Dressed in a sharp black suit, her presence was commanding yet understated. Detective Erica Lawson scanned the room with a practiced gaze before approaching the bar. Lena recognized her immediately. She had seen Erica's name on the news, linked to high-profile investigations. But what was a detective doing at Belladonna's? Lena's curiosity grew as she watched Erica speak briefly with Richard. The manager's face turned ashen, his usual bluster replaced by a nervous energy. After a few minutes, Erica left the restaurant, leaving Richard visibly shaken. During her break, Lena approached Ethan, a line cook known for his love of gossip. Who was that woman talking to Richard? Lena asked, keeping her tone casual. Ethan glanced around before leaning closer. That's Detective Lawson. She's been sniffing around Carter for months. Word is, she's trying to nail him for fraud or something. Apparently, he's got ties to some pretty shady stuff. Lena's mind raced. The pieces were starting to fit together. James Carter wasn't just a cruel millionaire. He was dangerous. And if Detective Lawson was after him, maybe Lena's experience could be the missing puzzle piece she needed. Unearthing the truth. That night, as the restaurant emptied out and the staff began cleaning, Lena lingered near the office. Richard had left early, his nerves frayed after the detective's visit. The door to his office was slightly ajar, and Lena couldn't resist the pull of curiosity. Inside, she spotted a folder on the desk with James Carter's name emblazoned on it. Glancing around to ensure she was alone, Lena stepped inside and opened the folder. What she found made her stomach churn. The documents detailed a series of transactions involving Carter's businesses, shell companies, offshore accounts, and properties acquired through suspicious means. There were notes about evictions and land deals that disproportionately impacted low-income neighborhoods, often displacing families like hers. The final page was a report, likely compiled by Erica Lawson, suggesting Carter had bribed officials to bury investigations. Lena's hands trembled as she snapped pictures of the documents with her phone. This was bigger than she had imagined. Carter's cruelty wasn't just personal, it was systemic. He had built his empire on the suffering of others, and she wasn't going to let him continue unchecked. A new ally. The next morning, Lena contacted Detective Lawson. Nervous but resolute, she explained what had happened at the restaurant and hinted at the documents she had found. To her surprise, Lawson didn't dismiss her. I've been trying to bring Carter down for over a year, Lawson said during their meeting at a local cafe. But his money and connections make it nearly impossible. If you're willing to testify, Lena, your story could be the breakthrough we need. Lena hesitated. The thought of going up against someone as powerful as James Carter was terrifying. But then she thought of Miles, of the world she wanted him to grow up in. She couldn't let fear hold her back. I'll do it, Lena said, her voice steady. But I'm not just doing this for me. I'm doing it for everyone he's hurt. Lawson nodded, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. You're braver than most people I've met, Lena. Let's make sure he doesn't get away with this. The fight ahead. As Lena walked home that evening, a sense of purpose filled her. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew Carter wouldn't go down without a fight, but she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. With Detective Lawson by her side, and the truth on her side, Lena was ready to face whatever came next. This wasn't just a battle for justice. It was a battle for her dignity, her son's future, and the countless others who had suffered in silence. James Carter had underestimated her, but he was about to learn a powerful lesson. Even the smallest voice could spark a revolution. Breaking the chains. Lena woke up the next morning with a newfound resolve, but also an ache of anxiety deep in her chest. As sunlight filtered through the worn curtains of her small apartment, she looked over at her son, Miles, who was still sleeping soundly. His face, peaceful and innocent, was her anchor. He had no idea of the storm brewing in her life, and she intended to keep it that way. For now, after getting Miles ready for school and leaving him with her mother, Lena set out to meet Detective Lawson. The meeting was arranged in a discreet location, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, far from the prying eyes of the restaurant regulars and anyone connected to James Carter. As Lena entered, she spotted Lawson sitting in a corner booth, her no-nonsense demeanor offset by a warm smile meant to put Lena at ease. "Lena," Lawson greeted, standing up and extending a hand. "I'm glad you came." "I don't think I had much of a choice," Lena replied, sliding into the booth. Her voice was steady, but her hands fidgeted with the strap of her purse. "If I don't stand up now, I don't know if I ever will." Lawson nodded approvingly. Courage is rare, especially when going up against someone like James Carter. "But before we move forward, I need you to know the risks. Testifying against him, even just providing information, could make you a target." Lena's stomach tightened at the warning, but she forced herself to hold Lawson's gaze. What kind of target? Carter's connections run deep. Politicians, law enforcement, business moguls. He's got his hands in a lot of pockets. If he finds out you're involved, he might try to discredit you, intimidate you, or worse. That's why we need to handle this carefully. Lena swallowed hard. She had expected this to be difficult, but the stakes were even higher than she'd imagined. Still, she wasn't backing down. "What do you need me to do?" Lawson leaned forward, her tone serious. "First, I need everything you can give me about his behavior, his interactions at the restaurant, anything unusual you've seen or overheard." "You mentioned documents." Lena nodded, pulling out her phone. She opened her photo gallery and slid it across the table. Lawson's eyes widened slightly as she scrolled through the images. This is gold," Lawson muttered, her voice tinged with excitement. "It corroborates some of the financial irregularities we've been tracking. If we can connect these transactions to his illegal activities, we might have enough to issue a warrant." "But will it be enough to stop him?" Lena asked, her voice tinged with desperation. Lawson looked at her thoughtfully. "Stopping someone like Carter isn't just about taking him to court. It's about exposing him. People like him thrive on their reputation. If we can shatter that, we strip him of his power." Lena nodded, understanding the weight of Lawson's words. It wasn't just about justice. It was about dismantling a system that allowed people like Carter to operate with impunity. The restaurant's quiet rebellion. Back at Belladonna's bistro, the atmosphere was different. Word had spread among the staff about what James Carter had done to Lena. Most of her coworkers had avoided discussing it openly, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. Even the regular patrons seemed to tread lightly, as if sensing the shift. Samantha, a server Lena had always been friendly with, approached her during a quiet moment in the break room. "Hey, Lena," she began hesitantly. I wanted to say I'm sorry for not standing up for you that night." Lena looked up, surprised by the admission. "You don't have to apologize, Sam. I know how it is here." "No," Samantha interrupted, shaking her head. "It's not okay. What he did to you was disgusting, and the fact that none of us spoke up, it's just wrong. I don't know if this helps, but if you need anything, I'm here." The words, though simple, meant more to Lena than she let on. For the first time, She felt a glimmer of solidarity among her coworkers. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Later that evening, while clearing tables, Lena overheard a conversation between Richard Saunders and another regular. She ducked behind a column, straining to hear. "I don't care what Lawson thinks she knows," Richard was saying, his voice low and agitated. "Carter's untouchable. He's been through worse and walked away without a scratch. You think some waitress is going to change that?" Lena's jaw tightened. Richard's words stung, but they also fueled her determination. He might dismiss her as some waitress, but she was about to prove him wrong. The threats begin. The first sign that Carter was aware of her actions came 2 days later. As Lena was walking home after her shift, she noticed a sleek black car parked across the street from her apartment building. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. At first, she dismissed it as a coincidence, but when the car was still there the following night, her unease grew. The next morning, Lena found a note slipped under her door. The message was simple but chilling. "Stay in your lane, or you'll regret it." She sat on the edge of her bed, the note trembling in her hands. Fear clawed at her chest, but she refused to let it take hold. Instead, she called Lawson. "It's starting," Lena said as soon as the detective answered. "What happened?" Lawson's tone was sharp, alert. Lena explained about the car and the note. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Lawson spoke. "We'll increase surveillance around your building. And Lena, don't confront anyone. If you see something, call me immediately." Lena agreed, but the fear lingered. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not with Miles to think about. That evening, as she tucked him into bed, she felt a pang of guilt. He didn't deserve to be caught up in this, but she reminded herself that everything she was doing was for him. A shocking revelation. The following week, Lawson invited Lena to her office to review the evidence. As they went through the documents and discussed strategy, Lawson pulled out a folder of her own. "There's something you need to see," Lawson said, her voice heavy with significance. She slid a photo across the desk, a grainy image of Carter shaking hands with a man Lena didn't recognize. "Who's that?" Lena asked, studying the picture. "Marcus Harlan," Lawson replied. "A known figure in organized crime. He's suspected of running a money laundering operation that funnels millions through legitimate businesses, including, we believe, Carter's." Lena's stomach dropped. She had known Carter was corrupt, but this was on another level. "So he's working with criminals." "Not just working with them," Lawson said grimly. "He's protecting them. Carter's connections in politics and law enforcement make him invaluable to people like Harlan. That's why taking him down is so difficult. But with your help, we might finally have enough to expose the entire network." Lena's mind reeled. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about dismantling a web of corruption that extended far beyond the restaurant. The weight of what she had gotten herself into pressed down on her, but she refused to back out. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Lawson's eyes met hers, filled with determination. "We take the fight to him. But Lena, you need to be ready. Things are about to get dangerous. A reckoning in sight." That night, as Lena walked home, she felt the weight of the battle ahead. James Carter had power, money, and connections, but he had underestimated her resolve. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a mother, a fighter, and a woman determined to stand up for what was right. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment, she noticed something new, a small group of her coworkers waiting by her door. Samantha was among them, along with Ethan and a few others. "We've been talking," Samantha said, stepping forward, "and we want to help. Whatever you're planning, we're with you." Lena felt a surge of emotion. For the first time, she realized she wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they might just have a chance. The battle against James Carter was far from over, but Lena knew one thing for certain. He was about to learn the true meaning of power. And it didn't come from money or connections. It came from people who refused to be silenced. the fire within. The next day brought a renewed sense of purpose. Lena stood in her tiny kitchen, the morning light pouring in through the window. The weight of everything was heavy, but there was also a flicker of hope, a fire ignited by the unexpected support of her coworkers and the relentless determination of Detective Lawson. As Miles munched on a bowl of cereal at the table, he looked up at his mother. "Mommy, why do you look so serious?" he asked, his innocent voice pulling her from her thoughts. Lena knelt beside him, smoothing his hair. "Because Mommy's got a big job to do," she said with a soft smile. "It's about making things better for us, so we can have more time together." Miles tilted his head, his young mind working to process her words. "You're a superhero, right? Like in my cartoons." Lena chuckled, though her eyes glistened with tears. "Something like that, baby. Now finish your breakfast, okay?" As she watched him eat, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about bringing James Carter to justice. It was about creating a world where her son wouldn't grow up thinking it was normal for people like them to be treated as invisible. Gathering allies. That afternoon, Lena met Samantha, Ethan, and the other coworkers who had approached her the night before. They gathered in the back of a small, quiet diner far from the restaurant district, each person looking nervous but resolute. Samantha spoke first. "Lena, we've all seen how James treats you, and everyone else. We're tired of staying quiet." Ethan nodded. "It's not just Carter. It's Richard too. He lets it happen because he cares more about his pockets than about us." Lena glanced around the table, seeing determination in their faces. These were people who had endured the same invisible battles she had: unspoken prejudices, blatant favoritism, and a system that valued money over dignity. "If we're going to do this," Lena began, her voice steady, "we have to be smart. Carter has power, and he won't hesitate to use it. But together, we can expose him for who he really is." The group leaned in as Lena outlined the plan she had been forming in her mind. They would document everything, every inappropriate comment, every instance of abuse or corruption they witnessed at the restaurant. They would create a record so undeniable that even Carter's influence couldn't bury it. But that wasn't all. Lena had an idea that went beyond the restaurant walls. Unveiling the system. Lena reached out to an old friend, Rachel Martinez, a journalist known for her investigative reporting on systemic injustice. They hadn't spoken in years, but when Lena explained the situation, Rachel's interest was immediate. "This isn't just a story, Lena," Rachel said during their first meeting at a coffee shop. "This is a bombshell waiting to go off. If Carter's as entrenched as you say, exposing him could ripple far beyond the restaurant." Rachel agreed to help, on the condition that Lena and her coworkers were willing to go on the record. It was a daunting prospect, but Lena knew it was necessary. They couldn't afford to let this story be ignored. Meanwhile, Detective Lawson was making her own moves. With the documents Lena had provided, Lawson had secured a warrant to dig deeper into Carter's financial dealings. The evidence was damning. Offshore accounts, falsified records, and connections to notorious figures like Marcus Harlan. But Lawson knew they needed more to bring Carter down publicly. "That's where you come in," Lawson told Lena during a late-night phone call. "Your testimony isn't just about what happened in the restaurant. It's about showing the world who Carter really is." The retaliation begins. As the investigation gained momentum, so did Carter's retaliation. One evening, Lena returned home to find her apartment ransacked. Drawers were overturned, and her few valuables were scattered across the floor. A sense of violation washed over her as she stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. Miles clung to her leg, his voice trembling. "Mommy, why is our stuff all messy?" Lena swallowed her fear and knelt beside him. "It's okay, baby. Someone made a mistake, but we're going to fix it." She immediately called Lawson, who arrived within the hour. The detective surveyed the damage, her jaw tightening. "This wasn't random. They're trying to scare you." Lena clenched her fists. "It's not going to work." Lawson placed a reassuring hand on Lena's shoulder. "We'll put extra patrols around your building. But Lena, be careful. They're getting desperate. A growing movement. The break-in, rather than silencing Lena, galvanized her resolve. At the restaurant, whispers of her fight began to spread among the staff. More coworkers came forward, sharing their own stories of Carter's abuses, racist comments, underpaid overtime, even threats of firing when they tried to speak up. One night, during a lull in service, a dishwasher named Marcus, who rarely spoke, approached Lena. "I heard what you're doing," he said quietly. "I got something you might want to see." He handed her a flash drive, explaining that it contained surveillance footage from the restaurant's back offices. "Carter doesn't know I kept copies," Marcus said. "But I've seen enough to know he needs to be stopped." Lena thanked him, her heart racing. When she reviewed the footage later, her suspicions were confirmed. The videos showed Carter meeting with shady individuals in the restaurant's private dining room, discussing deals that reeked of corruption. One clip even captured him laughing about how untouchable he was. The catalyst. The final piece of the puzzle came unexpectedly. One of Carter's former assistants, Angela Boyd, contacted Lena after hearing about her fight. Angela had worked for Carter for years, but had left after witnessing his illegal dealings firsthand. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," Angela said during their meeting. "He thinks he's above the law, but he's wrong." Angela provided Lena with a trove of emails and documents, proof of Carter's bribes, illegal land acquisitions, and his connections to organized crime. It was the smoking gun they needed. The breaking point. With the evidence mounting, Rachel Martinez published a scathing expose on Carter. The story detailed his abuses at the restaurant, his financial crimes, and his connections to Marcus Harlan. It included testimonials from Lena, her coworkers, and Angela, painting a damning picture of a man who had built his empire on exploitation and corruption. The article spread like wildfire. News outlets picked up the story, and public outrage erupted. Protests were organized outside the restaurant, demanding accountability. Social media lit up with calls for Carter's arrest. For the first time, James Carter's untouchable facade began to crack. The arrest. The turning point came a week later when Detective Lawson, armed with the new evidence, led a raid on Carter's estate. The once smug millionaire was taken into custody, his face pale and drawn as cameras captured the moment. At the restaurant, Richard Saunders tried to distance himself from the scandal, but his complicity was undeniable. Under pressure from public backlash, Belladonna's Bistro announced new management, pledging to create a safer and more equitable environment for its staff. A new beginning. As Lena watched the news that evening, a sense of relief washed over her. Carter was behind bars, his empire crumbling. It wasn't just her victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced or overlooked. But Lena knew this was just the beginning. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to stop using it. With the help of Rachel and her newfound allies, she began planning the next chapter of her life. A community cafe that would provide opportunities for people like her. A place where dignity and respect were served alongside coffee. As Miles snuggled beside her on the couch, Lena smiled. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. The aftermath of justice. The news of James Carter's arrest rippled across the city like a shockwave, leaving no corner untouched. Television screens blared his downfall, newspapers printed his mugshot, and social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForLena and #CarterExposed. For Lena Brooks, however, the victory was bittersweet. The world may have seen her as a hero, but her life was still far from easy. The spotlight. Lena became an unwitting symbol of resilience and justice. Media outlets wanted interviews, advocacy groups reached out, and strangers on the street stopped her to offer words of encouragement. At first, the attention was overwhelming. Lena wasn't used to being the center of anything, much less a national conversation about power, race, and justice. One evening, a knock on her door startled her. She opened it to find a woman in her late 40s, her face lined with stress, but softened by gratitude. "Miss Brooks, the woman said, clutching a small gift bag. "I'm Deborah Fields. I used to work for James Carter. I wanted to thank you." Lena frowned in confusion. "Thank me?" Deborah nodded, her voice trembling. "When I was younger, I worked as one of his personal assistants. He treated me terribly, like I was disposable. I never had the courage to stand up to him, but you did. You gave me, and so many others, hope." Lena accepted the gift bag, her throat tight with emotion. Inside was a small hand-knit scarf. "It's not much," Deborah said, "but I wanted you to have something to remind you of how much you've inspired people." After Deborah left, Lena sat on her couch, the scarf draped over her lap. The weight of her actions began to sink in. She hadn't just stood up for herself. She'd lit a fire that burned far brighter than she'd ever imagined. Life at Belladonna's Bistro. While James Carter's empire crumbled, life at Belladonna's Bistro changed drastically. Richard Saunders, the spineless manager who had turned a blind eye to Carter's abuses, resigned under pressure from the new ownership. The restaurant's culture underwent a much-needed transformation, with policies put in place to ensure fair treatment of employees. Samantha, Ethan, and the other staff who had supported Lena found themselves emboldened. They started speaking up about issues that had long been ignored, from unequal pay to toxic workplace dynamics. The restaurant slowly began to feel less like a battlefield and more like a place where everyone could thrive. Lena, however, found it difficult to return to her role as a waitress. Every time she walked through the doors, she was reminded of the night Carter humiliated her. Customers treated her with a mix of admiration and pity, which only deepened her discomfort. During a quiet moment in the kitchen, Samantha approached her. "Have you thought about what's next?" she asked gently. Lena sighed, leaning against the counter. "I have, but it's hard to imagine a future that doesn't revolve around survival." Samantha smiled. "You've already proven you're capable of so much more. Maybe it's time to start building the life you deserve." The cafe dream. That night, as Lena sat at her kitchen table, she pulled out an old notebook she hadn't touched in years. It was filled with sketches and notes about a cafe she had dreamed of opening, one that would serve as a safe haven for people like her, a place where no one would feel invisible. The idea felt daunting. She had no savings, no investors, and no idea where to start. But as she looked at Miles, who was drawing at the table beside her, she knew she couldn't let fear hold her back. "Mommy, what are you doing?" Miles asked, peeking at her notebook. "I'm making a plan," Lena replied with a smile. "A plan for something big." Miles grinned. "Like a superhero plan." "Exactly," she said, ruffling his hair. "A superhero plan. A chance encounter." A week later, Lena attended a community event organized by one of the advocacy groups that had reached out to her. The event was focused on empowering workers and fighting systemic injustice. As Lena mingled with attendees, she met Gregory Hunt, a local entrepreneur known for investing in small businesses. Gregory was impressed by Lena's story and her quiet determination. "You're an inspiration," he said. "What's next for you?" Lena hesitated before replying. "I've always dreamed of opening a cafe, a place that offers more than just food, opportunities for people who've been overlooked." Gregory's eyes lit up. "That's a powerful idea. Have you thought about how to fund it?" Lena shook her head. "I don't even know where to begin." Gregory handed her his business card. "Let's talk. I believe in people like you, Lena, people who don't just dream but act." Building a vision. Over the next few months, Lena worked tirelessly to bring her dream to life. With Gregory's guidance and a modest investment, she secured a small space in a neighborhood that desperately needed revitalization. The cafe, named Miles and More, was a tribute to her son and the countless miles she had walked to get to this point. The cafe's mission was clear: to provide fair wages, safe working conditions, and opportunities for people who had faced systemic barriers. Lena hired a diverse team, including some of her former coworkers from Belladonna's Bistro. She partnered with local farmers and vendors, ensuring that every aspect of the business aligned with her values. On opening day, the cafe was filled with friends, family, and members of the community. Detective Lawson was there, along with Rachel Martinez, and even some of the patrons from the bistro who had supported Lena during her darkest moments. As Lena stood behind the counter, watching Miles help serve pastries to customers, she felt a sense of fulfillment she had never known. This wasn't just a cafe. It was a beacon of hope. The ripple effect. The success of Miles and More sparked a movement. Other small businesses began adopting similar practices, prioritizing their workers and giving back to their communities. Advocacy groups used Lena's story as an example of what could happen when people stood up against injustice. Even the legal battle against James Carter continued to make waves. Thanks to the testimony of Lena and others, Carter faced a lengthy trial that exposed the full extent of his crimes. Though his lawyers fought hard, the evidence was overwhelming. Carter was convicted on multiple charges, including fraud and conspiracy, and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. For Lena, the conviction was less about revenge and more about accountability. Carter's downfall wasn't just her victory. It was a reminder that no one was truly untouchable. The legacy. Months later, Lena sat on the patio of Miles and More, sipping coffee as the sun set. Miles played with a group of children nearby, his laughter filling the air. The cafe was thriving, but more importantly, it had become a place where people felt seen and valued. Samantha and Ethan joined her at the table, their faces glowing with pride. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Ethan said, shaking his head. Lena smiled. "It's only the beginning." As the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Lena reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She had faced humiliation, fear, and uncertainty, but she had also discovered her strength, her voice, and her purpose. James Carter had tried to break her, but instead, he had ignited a fire that would burn long after he was forgotten. Lena Brooks was no longer just a waitress. She was a fighter, a leader, and a symbol of hope for everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. And as she watched Miles run toward her with open arms, she knew that this life, this legacy, was the true victory, a future forged in resilience. The months following the success of Miles and More brought a whirlwind of challenges, triumphs, and new beginnings for Lena Brooks. She had stepped into a role she never imagined for herself. Not just a business owner, but a community leader, an advocate, and a beacon of hope. However, with this newfound position came a greater responsibility, one that Lena was determined to embrace. Miles and More, a safe haven. The cafe quickly became more than just a business. Miles and More was a sanctuary for the community, a place where people could gather without judgment. Lena's hiring practices focused on individuals who had faced systemic barriers, single parents, formerly incarcerated individuals, and people from marginalized communities. One such employee was Sean Harper, a young man in his late 20s who had struggled to find work after being released from prison. Sean had grown up in a neighborhood plagued by poverty and violence, and his criminal record made it nearly impossible for him to rebuild his life. "Thank you for giving me a chance," Sean said one afternoon as he worked behind the counter. "Most people just see my past. You saw something else." Lena smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance. Just pay it forward when you can." Sean's story was one of many that underscored the cafe's mission. It wasn't just about serving coffee and pastries. It was about creating opportunities and changing lives. The ripples of change. As Miles and More flourished, so did Lena's reputation. Advocacy groups began inviting her to speak at events about worker rights and systemic injustice. At first, Lena was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't her forte, and the thought of standing in front of large audiences made her stomach churn. But with each invitation, she reminded herself of the stakes. At one event hosted by a prominent workers' rights organization, Lena shared her story. The room was packed, the energy palpable as she stepped onto the stage. "I never thought of myself as a fighter," Lena began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "For most of my life, I believed that staying quiet was the safest choice. But the moment I let someone strip me of my dignity, I realized that silence wasn't safety, it was complicity. She paused, scanning the faces in the audience. We live in a world where power and privilege often go unchecked. But power doesn't have to mean money or connections. Real power is standing together, lifting each other up, and refusing to let injustice go unanswered. Her words sparked a standing ovation. Advocacy leaders approached her afterward, urging her to consider expanding her work beyond the cafe. Your story has inspired a movement, one organizer told her. Imagine what you could do on a larger scale. Confronting old demons. Despite her growing success, Lena couldn't entirely escape the shadows of her past. One evening, as she was closing the cafe, she received a call from Detective Erica Lawson. "Lena, I need to give you a heads up," Lawson said, her tone cautious. "Carter's legal team is working overtime to get him a reduced sentence. They're claiming that his behavior was the result of mental health issues." Lena's grip on the phone tightened. "You're telling me he might get off easy?" "Not if I can help it," Lawson replied. "But they're pulling out all the stops. They've even started dragging your name into it, claiming you're trying to profit off the situation." Lena felt a surge of anger. After everything she had endured, Carter was still trying to manipulate the narrative. But this time, she wouldn't let him. "Let them say what they want," Lena said firmly. "The truth is out there, and I'm not going to let them rewrite it." A show of solidarity. The news of Carter's legal maneuvering reignited public outrage. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read "Justice for Lena" and "No deals for Carter." The movement had taken on a life of its own, fueled by Lena's unwavering determination. One day, as Lena arrived at the cafe, she was greeted by a group of her former coworkers from Belladonna's Bistro. Samantha, Ethan, and others had organized a surprise rally to show their support. "You're not in this alone," Samantha said, handing Lena a megaphone. "We're all behind you." Lena's heart swelled with gratitude. She stepped onto a makeshift platform, addressing the crowd that had gathered outside the cafe. "This fight isn't just about me," she said, her voice echoing through the street. "It's about every worker who has ever been silenced, every person who has been told their worth is tied to their paycheck. We're here to say enough is enough." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy invigorating Lena. For the first time, she felt not just supported, but truly seen. A decision to expand. As Lena balanced her responsibilities at the cafe with her growing role as an advocate, she began to dream bigger. What if Miles and More wasn't just one cafe? What if it became a network of safe havens across the city, or even the country? Lena reached out to Gregory Hunt, the entrepreneur who had helped her launch the cafe. Together, they crafted a plan to expand while staying true to the cafe's mission. They partnered with local nonprofits to identify underserved communities and provide training programs for new hires. By the end of the year, Miles and More had opened 2 additional locations. Each cafe employed people who had been overlooked by traditional employers, giving them a chance to rebuild their lives. Carter's final defeat. Meanwhile, Carter's legal battle reached its climax. Despite his team's efforts to paint him as a victim of circumstance, the overwhelming evidence against him, combined with the public pressure, proved too much to overcome. The court upheld his original sentence, ensuring he would serve significant time behind bars. Lena attended the final day of the trial, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. When the verdict was read, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Carter's smug arrogance had finally crumbled, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who had lost everything. As Lena left the courthouse, reporters swarmed her, eager for a statement. She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "This isn't about one man's downfall," she said. "It's about creating a world where no one can wield power without accountability. And we're just getting started. A legacy of hope." Years later, Lena stood in the middle of a bustling cafe, one of 10 Miles and More locations that now spanned the state. The walls were adorned with photos and quotes from employees whose lives had been transformed by the business. A small plaque near the entrance read, "Dedicated to those who refuse to be invisible." Miles, now a teenager, worked part-time at the cafe, proudly serving customers and sharing stories about his mother's journey. Watching him thrive filled Lena with a sense of fulfillment she could barely put into words. One afternoon, as Lena sat with Samantha and Ethan at a corner table, they reflected on how far they had come. "Can you believe it all started with chili sauce?" Ethan joked, earning a laugh from the group. Lena smiled, her gaze drifting to the bustling cafe around her. "It didn't just start there," she said. "It started the moment we decided not to stay quiet." As the sun set outside, casting a warm glow over the cafe, Lena felt a deep sense of peace. She had faced unimaginable challenges, but she had emerged stronger, more determined, and more hopeful than ever. James Carter had tried to break her, but instead, he had sparked a movement. And that movement, born from resilience and fueled by unity, was just beginning to change the world. Community rising. The expansion of Miles and More wasn't just about opening cafes, it was about planting seeds of change. Lena ensured that each new location partnered with local organizations to address broader issues like housing insecurity, education, and workforce development. The cafes hosted job training programs, financial literacy workshops, and even free tutoring sessions for children. Lena became a fixture at city council meetings, advocating for policies that protected workers and supported small businesses. She wasn't just a voice for her employees. She was a voice for the voiceless. Slowly, the city began to change. Landlords reconsidered eviction practices. Companies started auditing their policies for fairness. And young people from marginalized neighborhoods began to believe in opportunities they hadn't dared to dream of before. A mentor and a guide. As Miles and More grew, Lena took on a new role, mentoring young women and single mothers who were in the same position she had once been in. One such woman was Trina Daniels, a 22-year-old struggling to provide for her 2 children while working 2 jobs. Trina's introduction to Lena came through one of the cafe's workshops. After hearing Lena's story, she approached her with a mixture of awe and desperation. "Ms. Brooks," Trina began, her voice trembling, "I don't know how you did it. Some days I don't even think I can make it through the week." Lena took Trina's hands in hers. "You're stronger than you think, Trina, and you're not alone. Let's figure this out together." Under Lena's guidance, Trina found a stable job at one of the cafes, enrolled in a vocational training program, and started saving for her own apartment. Watching Trina's transformation reminded Lena of her own journey and reinforced why she had taken this path. A reunion of sorts. One evening, Lena received an unexpected letter from Deborah Fields, the former assistant of James Carter who had thanked her months earlier. This time, Deborah wasn't just reaching out to express gratitude. She had startling news. Deborah's letter detailed how Carter's network of corruption had extended into hidden partnerships that were just beginning to come to light. She had been subpoenaed to testify in another trial linked to his dealings. Deborah wanted Lena to know that her bravery had inspired her to speak out. "It was your courage that gave me the strength to finally tell the truth," Deborah wrote. "Because of you, I know that people like Carter can be held accountable." The letter left Lena both humbled and emboldened. The fight against corruption wasn't over, but knowing that her actions had encouraged others to take a stand filled her with renewed determination. A personal milestone. Miles's 10th birthday approached, and Lena wanted to make it special. For years, she had been too consumed by survival to celebrate milestones properly, but this time was different. She organized a small party at the original Miles and More, inviting close friends, employees, and their families. As the guests gathered around, singing "Happy Birthday," Miles beamed with joy. When it came time to blow out the candles, he paused and looked at his mother. "Mom, I don't need to make a wish," he said. "I already have everything I want." The room erupted in laughter and applause, but Lena's heart swelled with emotion. In that moment, she realized that all her struggles, all her sacrifices, had been worth it. She had given her son something priceless: security, love, and the belief that anything was possible. The final nail in Carter's coffin. While Lena focused on building her future, Carter's empire continued to unravel. More former employees, partners, and victims came forward, emboldened by the public support Lena had received. Investigative journalists uncovered additional layers of his corruption, revealing the full scope of his exploitation. Eventually, the pressure became too much for even Carter's most loyal allies. Key figures in his network turned on him, trading testimony for reduced sentences. By the time his final appeal reached court, Carter's legal team had been decimated, and his reputation was irreparably tarnished. Lena attended the final hearing, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom. When the judge upheld Carter's maximum sentence, a wave of relief washed over her. Justice, though delayed, had been served. Afterward, as Lena walked out of the courthouse, a journalist approached her. "Ms. Brooks, do you have any final words about James Carter?" Lena paused, choosing her words carefully. This was never about one man. It was about showing that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, they're not above accountability. And it's about proving that when people come together, they can make the impossible happen. A global movement. The legacy of Lena's stand against James Carter began to spread beyond the city. Workers' rights advocates from across the country cited her story as a turning point. She was invited to speak at national conferences, participate in panels, and even consulted with lawmakers drafting labor reform bills. Lena used every platform she was given to amplify the voices of others. She shared stories of workers who had faced similar struggles, ensuring that the movement she had started was never just about her. One evening, while preparing for a televised interview, Lena received a call from Detective Lawson. The detective's voice was warm, tinged with pride. "You've come a long way, Lena," Lawson said. "I knew you were strong, but I never imagined you'd spark something this big." Lena chuckled softly. "I didn't do it alone. People like you, Samantha, Ethan, and everyone who stood with me. You're all part of this." Lawson's voice grew serious. "You're not just part of something, Lena. You're leading it." A quiet reflection. On the anniversary of the cafe's opening, Lena found herself alone in the original Miles, and more after hours. The walls were lined with photos of employees and community events, each image telling a story of transformation. She traced her fingers along the counter, remembering the countless nights she had spent dreaming of this place. As she sat at one of the tables, Miles walked in, holding a notebook. "Mom," he said, sitting beside her, "I've been working on something." He opened the notebook to reveal sketches and notes for a community garden project. "I thought we could grow food here and give it to people who need it." Lena's eyes filled with tears. "That's an incredible idea, Miles." He grinned. "I want to help people, like you do." Lena pulled him into a hug, her heart swelling with pride. "You're already making a difference, sweetheart." The road ahead. Lena knew her journey was far from over. The fight for justice, dignity, and equality was ongoing, but she welcomed it with open arms. She had turned her pain into power, her humiliation into hope, and her silence into a roar that echoed far beyond her own life. As she looked toward the future, Lena felt a deep sense of peace. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. And as she walked out of the cafe with Miles by her side, the world felt full of endless possibilities. Because Lena Brooks had proven one undeniable truth: even the smallest voices could spark a revolution, and one act of courage could change the game forever.